Thank you, Chairman. Thank you to you and your co-chair, Representative Lowy, for your leadership of this group. I hope that we are able to be effective and to discharge our duties here. I note that we are both senators and House members, and the Senate and the House have different perspectives and different procedures. And the problem areas are budget and appropriations, and budgeters and appropriators have different procedures and perspectives. I do believe there are some commonalities. I think we can probably agree together that a two-year budget cycle makes more sense. We could perhaps even agree that a two-year appropriation cycle, perhaps staggered year to year, might make some sense. We can perhaps agree that the executive branch doesn't need to have a formal role in the budget timeframe and process, that there's plenty of political interaction to take place so that we don't need to boil that into our scheduling. But I would just like to say a few words from my perspective as a senator who sits on the Senate Budget Committee. I would concur with Senator Perdue that the Senate Budget Committee process is completely broken. It became ineffectual when the Senate went to a 60-vote baseline for virtually everything, and the penalty for violating the Senate budget is 60 votes. A fence that is at the level of the ground is no fence at all. Moreover, the Senate Budget Committee is the mechanism for the delivery of reconciliation, which has been morphed over the years away from its original purpose to become a general partisan delivery system. Both sides, I think, need to stand down on that and redirect the Senate Budget Committee to a budget process. Now, in order to do that, I think there are some baselines that we have to achieve. The first is that we have to create within the Senate Budget Committee at least the possibility of a bipartisan process. Everything about the Senate process right now pushes towards partisanship. We need to create a rule that provides the option of traveling a bipartisan road. If we can get over the hurdle of bipartisanship, then there are some other things we need to consider. If we're going to look at debt and deficit, we have to comply with the mathematics of debt and deficit, which means you have to look at appropriated spending, you have to look at healthcare spending, you have to look at tax spending, and you have to look at revenues. If you're not looking at all of them, you are necessarily mathematically incomplete, and it's virtually impossible to get anything meaningful done. I think everybody who's ever been before the Senate Budget Committee has agreed that debt to GDP is the measure of safety with respect to long-term debt and with respect to regular deficits. So we need to do the basic task of deciding, and I think we can do this, bipartisan fashion, what's a fair and sustainable debt to GDP ratio, and then how long is it going to take us to get there? You don't land a plane by driving it straight down to the ground. You have a glide slope, and we need to have a glide slope. And what should that glide slope be? That's something I think we can also agree to. And then what are the warnings that let you know you're off your landing path, that you're not on the glide slope? I think we can install those as well. If we have a bipartisan path that considers all those elements, tracks us towards a sustainable debt to GDP ratio, and warns the public when we're off course, I think we will have accomplished a very significant task, and the Senate Budget Committee will once again be somewhat useful. I'd close by echoing what Representative Lowy said about the debt ceiling. I see the debt ceiling as like somebody who put a bear trap in their bedroom. And they know they're going to get up in the night, and if they're lucky, their best case scenario is that they avoid the bear trap. There is no good that comes of having that bear trap in the bedroom. There is the chance that you step in it. And if you step in it, it is a catastrophe. If we can build through this process some sense of public confidence that we have a track towards a sustainable debt to GDP ratio, then perhaps we can undo this completely unhelpful, completely manipulable, and dangerous debt ceiling process that we go through, which appeals to the very worst angels of the nature of our very worst angels. So with that, I look forward to working productively with everyone. I do think it's important that we understand that the Senate operates a little differently from the House, and budget folks have different perspectives from appropriators, and we all need to pull together to try to come up with something that can solve this problem. I think it's very doable, and I look forward to joining all my terrific colleagues in doing it, and I thank you both for your leadership.
Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you both for your testimony, not only here, but in many other Budget Committee hearings. Is it fair to say that you can't even calculate the deficit in any given year without looking at revenues, appropriated spending, healthcare spending, and tax spending? It's just a mathematical truth, correct?
That is true.
Both witnesses agree that is a mathematical truth. Good. And how broadly accepted is debt to GDP ratio as the metric, whatever the number actually is, but as the metric that we should be looking at with respect to a sustainable national debt?
I think that's pretty widely accepted. The footnote on that would be, what measure of debt do you want to put in their debt in the hands of the public or total debt? So I would be a fan of debt in the hands of the public as the economically relevant measure.
Ms. Coven?
I would agree, but you made an important distinction, which is what the number actually is, and that can vary with the business cycle. So it's not that there even is one number, but as a general measure,
Conversation should be about debt to GDP
it's a very
with
useful
those asterisks.
conversation to have. Correct.
Okay, that's good to know. And are we going to be able to fix this in a year, or do you need to plan for a glide slope that gets you from where we are to where we need to be?
It will certainly take many years. And in terms of where you need to be, I think the economically relevant thing is that the U.S. displayed to global capital markets that debt to GDP is on a downward trajectory, even if a tiny slope. But
let me jump
right now
in on
it's
that,
going
because that's
straight
a
up.
point that I'd like to ask you guys about. Let's say that all that this committee did was to secure the passage through Congress of a plan that set a sustainable debt to GDP ratio and set a mechanism for a glide slope to get there, and some alarms to let you know if you got off course. How do you believe global markets would react to that achievement now?
I don't think they react at all, because I think global markets would view that the way I view it, which is that's a fairly empty promise since you haven't got political buy-in on the policies.
So you'd actually have to start doing it.
Yeah.
Okay. And then how would they react?
That would be a very good day.
Okay. You have talked about the reconciliation process. In my view, in the Senate, it's been hijacked to completely unrelated purposes from dealing with the debt or the deficit. It's a bipartisan sin. We used reconciliation to help pass Obamacare. The Republicans just used reconciliation to pass massive deficit-creating tax cuts. So, and make this a response for the record if it's going to take a long time, but I'd be interested in what constraints or restrictions you think we might be able to agree on that would actually be effective in limiting reconciliation to its intended purpose now that it's kind of gotten out of control. How do we get it back in the cage?
Yeah, I want to make one very important distinction, though, which is that whatever your feelings on this panel may be about Obamacare, that was not legislation that was scored as adding to the deficit. I think we've seen that more in the tax arena, but it's certainly possible in the entitlement
and as somebody
arena.
who supported it very energetically, I like it too. I get all that, but I don't think it was our view that we were doing that as part of a debt and deficit measure. That was designed as a health care measure and to help people across the country. And we used this process because it worked, not because we were trying to solve primarily a debt or deficit problem.
Right. But I think the important thing is that it is more important that reconciliation not be abused and increase the deficit than to set some particular target for how much deficit reduction has to be achieved in order to have that tool.
Exactly.
The risk is in the negative direction, so what I would do is implement something like what used to be the Conrad rule in both chambers, which is to say that you can't use it to increase the deficit.
Okay. And if you have any further or more complicated thoughts than that you want to put in writing for me, I'd be interested, because we do need to solve, I think, the abuse of the reconciliation process in all of this.
So briefly, the thing I would just mention for everyone is that reconciliation is really a way to get around the rules of the Senate.
Yeah, exactly.
In the end. And so since this is a
and the Senate Budget
bicameral
Committee has become a
entity,
delivery system for that
I would
rule
hesitate to dictate to one chamber how they're going to run themselves. So I would
just
think
asking
about
for recommendations. You're not going to be dictating. Last thing, the debt ceiling. Upside, downside, specifically, what does it look like if one day we should fail at passing a needed debt ceiling and went into default?
U.S. Treasuries are the foundation of the global financial system. Impairing their liquidity even a little bit would be an economic catastrophe. It can't happen.
And similarly, the programmatic consequences of having to tell the American people, our contractors, everyone else we do business with, that we're not sure when we can pay you is, and we had to deal with planning for this, and a few years ago when we actually got up to it, it's no way to run a railroad.
Thank you both. Thank you to the chairman.